Angstrom Levy, in his desperate attempt to take revenge on Mark Grayson, had gathered multiple alternate versions of Invincible from different dimensions. These variants, each having taken a darker path, were ultimately trapped by Angstrom in a barren, desolate dimension. His plan was to retrieve them later for a final confrontation with Mark, but fate had other ideas. Before he could act, Angstrom was captured by the technicians who sought to use his knowledge and abilities for their own purposes. This left the 8 alternate versions of Mark stranded, with no apparent way to escape. At first, the 8 Marks spent their time conversing, sharing the events that had led them to become evil. Each of them had a different reason for their descent into darkness, some due to trauma, others because of power corrupting them, and a few simply due to a cruel twist of fate. Weeks passed in this isolated wasteland, and as their hunger grew unbearable, tensions rose. It soon became clear that one of them, a particularly arrogant and insufferable version, was despised by the others. Eventually, driven by starvation and resentment, the 7 decided to kill and consume him in order to survive. As their dire situation continued, the group dwindled further. The most ruthless among them, Sinister Mark, began to manipulate the others, subtly encouraging their descent into cannibalism. One by one, they turned on each other. Mohawk Mark, one of the more morally conflicted versions, initially took part in the horrific act, but quickly realized how monstrous it was. Disgusted by what he had become, he refused to eat any more of his counterparts. Instead, he started surviving by drinking his own sweat and finding other desperate means to sustain himself. Meanwhile, Sinister Mark, whose hunger had driven him to madness, relished in the acts of cannibalism. The experience unlocked something primal within him, a dark memory from his own dimension, where he had once resorted to consuming human flesh in times of crisis. As the days stretched on, he allowed his hair to grow long and unkempt, his appearance reflecting the beast he had become. With only 3 of them left, the hunger became unbearable. Sinister Mark and another remaining Invincible turned on the weakest of the trio, mercilessly killing and devouring him. Mohawk Mark, horrified by their actions, fled before he could be next. Sinister Mark, now completely consumed by his madness, pursued him with relentless hunger. However, Mohawk Mark managed to evade him, his will to survive outweighing his fear. Time passed and the situation grew bleaker. Now, only Sinister Mark and the last remaining evil Mark were left. With no one else to turn to, the weaker Mark found himself at the mercy of Sinister Mark, who had become something beyond human, beyond even Viltrumite. He was a monster now, driven by insatiable hunger and the thrill of the hunt. Without hesitation, he overpowered and killed his final counterpart. While Sinister Mark was eating him, the mainstream Mark would be banished into that alternate dimension by Angstrom. The mainstream Mark, confused, would approach Sinister Mark eating alternate Mark next to other skeletons. Sinister Mark would invite the mainstream Mark to eat the alternate Mark with him. Admitting that there is a lot of thigh left, he just started eating him because he recently killed him, and how thigh is the best part. Sinister Mark says that he thought this alternate Mark was the last one, in reality forgetting about Mohawk Mark, but says how he forgot about the mainstream Mark, who he believed was one of the 7 stranded with him. During all this time, Mohawk Mark was eating anything he could find except for his alternate selves. He grew skinny, but always kept an eye out for Sinister Mark, so he was always near Sinister Mark without him knowing. As the mainstream Mark realizes who Sinister Mark is, Sinister Mark says that he cannot believe that the alternate Marks thought that Sinister Mark planned the cannibalism, because he did not believe that he would be the last one to survive. Sinister Mark reveals how desperate and starving the alternate Marks were after a few weeks, and how the first one they ate was the worst of them all. Then, Sinister Mark starts to question if the mainstream Mark is real or if they ate him already, but by grabbing him, Sinister Mark determines that the mainstream Mark is real and has been stranded only recently. Mohawk Mark was also watching their encounter, but he decided only to watch and not interfere. The mainstream, Mark punches Sinister Mark away, sending him tumbling through the air. Sinister Mark regains his balance, unfazed, and remarks that his hunger never fades, but that he is also growing bored. He thanks the mainstream Mark for putting up a fight before declaring that the winner shall feast on the loser and the remains of the alternate Marks. The mainstream Mark, trying to reason with him, offers to help him return to his home dimension. Sinister Mark ignores the suggestion, instead pointing out that the alternate Marks never grew weaker from starvation, unlike the mainstream Mark, who has not endured weeks of isolation. Weakened by his lack of suffering, he is unfit to survive in this world. When the mainstream Mark insists that he only wants to help, Sinister Mark coldly states that the only way to do so is to let himself be devoured. Realizing negotiation is pointless, the mainstream Mark takes off at full speed, attempting to outrun his pursuer. Sinister Mark follows without hesitation, closing the distance with terrifying persistence. Eventually, he catches up, seizing the mainstream Mark and hurling him to the ground with bone-shattering force. The impact sends shockwaves through the terrain, and as the dust settles, Sinister Mark approaches, prepared to finish the fight. Before he can act, Mohawk Mark arrives, colliding into him with devastating force and knocking him away. Wasting no time, Mohawk Mark grabs the mainstream Mark and the two escape into the sky, putting distance between themselves and their relentless enemy. As they exchange hurried words, Sinister Mark tracks them down once again. He charges toward the mainstream Mark, completely disregarding Mohawk Mark's presence, fixated solely on his intended prey. Before he can strike, the mainstream Mark knocks him away and declares that he is no longer alone. Seizing the opportunity, Mohawk Mark slams Sinister Mark into the ground and unleashes a relentless assault. His punches land with raw fury, each one a reflection of his anger and betrayal. He shouts about how they could have escaped together, how there was another way, but Sinister Mark chose to turn them against one another. He was the worst of them, the one who had doomed them all. With no hesitation, Mohawk Mark beats Sinister Mark to death. The mainstream Mark tries to stop him, but by the time he moves, it is already too late. The battle is over, but the weight of what has happened lingers in the air, heavy and inescapable. Soon, Angstrom Levy opened a portal back to the mainstream dimension. The mainstream Mark spotted it instantly and rushed toward it, eager to return home, only to be trapped by Angstrom upon arrival. Moments later, Mohawk Mark also crossed into the mainstream dimension and immediately attacked Angstrom. Their fight raged on until the mainstream Mark reminded Mohawk Mark that if Angstrom died, he would have no way of returning home. Realizing this, Mohawk Mark hesitated, allowing Angstrom to trap him as well. Angstrom, unexpectedly, had a change of heart. He expressed regret for everything he had done and sincerely apologized to the mainstream Mark before releasing them both. He then opened a portal to Mohawk Mark's home dimension. However, just as it was about to close, Mohawk Mark grabbed Angstrom and dragged him through. Back in his own dimension, Mohawk Mark subjected Angstrom to relentless torture, demanding that he grant him access to other dimensions, territories he could conquer and add to his growing empire. Angstrom, now committed to making amends for his past mistakes, refused. Determined to break him, Mohawk Mark ordered his scientists to strip Angstrom of his powers while keeping him alive for as long as necessary. As time passed, Mohawk Mark underwent personal changes. He shaved off his mini goatee and, feeling the absence of Atom Eve in his life, hired prostitutes to cosplay as her, each one sporting a ginger mohawk and residing in his private chambers. Over time, he came to realize just how vile and twisted many of his alternate dimensional counterparts truly were. Eventually, the mainstream Mark sought to retrieve Angstrom, enlisting the help of the mainstream robot. Together, they devised a way to travel to Mohawk Mark's dimension. Upon arrival, Conquest escorted them to Mohawk Mark's personal chambers, assuming they were negotiators from Thrag's rebels. However, Mohawk Mark immediately recognized the mainstream Mark from their last encounter and dismissed Conquest. The mainstream Mark was visibly disturbed by the presence of the Atom Eve imposters, which Mohawk Mark acknowledged with little concern. In his world, Atom Eve had died, and this was simply how he coped with the void she left behind. Despite their differences, he remained grateful to the mainstream Mark for helping him escape the alternate dimension, letting go of any lingering resentment. When the mainstream Mark asked about Angstrom, Mohawk Mark assured him that the matter had been taken care of, though he could sense the mainstream Mark's lingering distrust. To prove he had nothing to hide, he personally led them to the facility where his scientists were holding Angstrom. Mohawk Mark explained that he was keeping him alive only until his scientists succeeded in removing his powers. Horrified, the mainstream Mark reacted with shock, confusing Mohawk Mark, who had assumed he intended to kill Angstrom himself. When the mainstream Mark admitted he had no intention of torturing Angstrom, Mohawk Mark dismissed his hesitation, suggesting that if the mainstream Mark ever turned evil, he could easily rule his world. At that moment, the mainstream robot realized the mainstream Mark could eventually stand in the way of his own plans. Seizing the opportunity, he activated a sonic pulse lethal to Viltrumites, incapacitating both Mohawk Mark and the mainstream Mark. Without hesitation, he executed Mohawk Mark's scientists to eliminate witnesses. As Mohawk Mark struggled to recover, Robot fired a specialized bomb into his mouth. The explosive burrowed deep into his esophagus, where his internal tissue was more vulnerable than his external defenses. When it detonated, it ruptured his throat, blasted out his eyeballs, and caused his organs to burst from within. Mohawk Mark was killed instantly. The last of the alternate Marks recruited by Angstrom Levy had finally met his end.